For over 3,000 years, soldiers have fought to shape the battlefield to their advantage. In fact, a quick walk around many battlefields will show the remnants of these efforts, small humps of earth and ditches that hundreds or thousands of men fought and died over. Today on the Warfighter Archives, we are covering battlefield fortifications. We'll examine how they were created, but more importantly, why. How were they maximized? What was their interaction with obstacles? And most importantly, how has a simple hole in the ground survived from the era of bronze swords to modern battle tanks? This video focuses on the different types of fortifications and the strategies that go into using them. Our next video will focus on how an attacking commander might overcome a fortification, and with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So, what is a fortification? For our purposes, we will define it as any structure that is designed to give a degree of cover and protection to friendly troops. We'll further break this down into a YouTube-friendly 4 numbered categories. Category number 1 is temporary fortifications. These are structures that are thrown up hastily and intended to either be taken down or abandoned after the battle. While they do provide some protection, it's generally insufficient against a sustained, determined enemy assault. An example of temporary fortifications would be earthworks, hastily dug mounds of earth, possibly strengthened with obstacles such as sharpened stakes. These fortifications were dug quickly and were generally abandoned when they were no longer needed. Also, some Roman castra or marching camps could fall into this category as well. For example, a tertia castra or a 3-day encampment was a temporary fortification, even if its construction, palisades, ditch, and gatehouses might suggest a more permanent structure. In fact, as a quick aside question, how did the Romans acquire the timber necessary to construct fortified camps on the march? I'll give an answer in a little bit, but let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. And on a quick tangent, the term castra is often used far too generally. While some, such as the aforementioned tertia castra, were temporary, others were semi-permanent, such as the winter camp or castra hiberna, and some were, as the name castra stativa suggests, permanent. But going back to temporary fortifications, a modern example would be the hasty fighting positions such as the foxhole, or a fighting hole if you were a US Marine. These are hastily prepared fortifications that are nearly always abandoned as soon as the fighting moves on. Some trenches fall into this category as well, though most trench networks fall into our next category. But before we move on, let me answer the earlier question. The Romans often carried substantial parts of the castra with them. Pieces of the palisades, especially the gatehouse, were usually loaded onto the legion's baggage train. This ensured that the legion would be able to construct a camp even if they found themselves in an area with few trees. It's crazy how advanced and organized the Roman legions were. But on to the next category, which is semi-permanent fortifications. These fortifications are generally sturdier and provide better protection than temporary fortifications. They are also usually meant to last for the duration of a campaign or possibly even the entire war. We already discussed how the castra hiberna fits this category. However, the most famous historical examples are probably the trench networks of World War I. In fact, the extensive networks of main trenches, connectors, and bastions are an excellent example of semi-permanent fortifications. They provided defenders with significant protection and were also designed to last for the duration of the war or until the front had moved on. However, once World War I ended, most trenches were abandoned and either filled in deliberately or allowed to fill in naturally over time. This excludes them from being placed into our third category. The third category of fortifications are permanent ones. These fortifications are generally extensive, built at great expense, and meant to serve as a permanent front line or defense for the border. A medieval example would be the castle, at least the larger ones that were converted into stone, such as Crac de Chevalier and some of the other great castles of the time. Such great fortresses were designed to serve as the anchor in a nation's defensive network. For example, Crac de Chevalier was a critical link in the network of castles that defended the Crusader states. The most famous modern example of a permanent fortification was the Maginot Line. This huge network of fortifications included not just gun casemates and bastions, it also included communications, living quarters, and mess halls. It even had a small train system. Unlike the more temporary trench networks of World War I, The Maginot Line was clearly designed to be a permanent defensive structure, even if that didn't turn out to be the case. And finally, the fourth category of fortifications is a bit more niche and uncommon. Those are mobile fortifications, and specifically, I'm thinking of siege towers in this instance. These towers on wheels were often pushed up to the battlements to act as a sort of mobile fortress, a point from which the attackers could shoot and launch attacks. In this way, it functioned much like a fortification, even though it was somewhat mobile. Hussite wagon forts could fit into this category, though I'd argue against it, and here's why. In general, the Hussite wagons were either static fortifications, where they were really more temporary fortifications than anything else. If the Hussites mounted up into them, they became mobile fighting vehicles, and they were essentially a medieval version of the open top troop carriers such as the half track. By comparison, we don't consider half tracks to be mobile fortifications, so it'd be improper to consider the war wagon as such. But let me know what you think in the comments section. Do you agree or disagree? Should I include war wagons as a sort of mobile fortification? Or is it fair to consider them to be more of an infantry fighting vehicle? But either way, now that we've gone over the different types of fortifications, what are they used for? How are they used? And what strategies are employed? What drives the decision making process? We'll cover all these questions below. But first, if you've enjoyed this content so far, please consider hitting the like and subscribe button. It helps to let me know what type of content brings value to you. Thank you, and with that out of the way, let's go ahead and continue. So, our first question is, what are fortifications used for? And you might say that it's obvious. They're used to help your soldiers defend a position, and that's certainly correct. But it goes a little bit deeper than that. In fact, fortifications aren't usually meant to defend the area that they are built on. I might sound crazy, but let's break it down and I'll show you what I mean. At the most basic level, fortifications are designed to control movement, specifically access. Consider this: the exact location of a castle wasn't usually that important. What was important was the area that the castle controlled access to. No one cared about the hill that Crac de Chevalier was built on. It was built to control access to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Similarly, in World War One, the French didn't dig in to protect the Somme. They dug in to prevent the Germans from maneuvering and threatening Paris and the French heartlands. In other words, fortifications are usually built to control an axis of advance, denying it to the enemy while still allowing friendly units to use it. Keeping this concept of controlling movement in mind is important as we move forward in our analysis. And speaking of that analysis, what are some ways that you could use fortifications? Well, for defense, obviously, right? But what about attacking? The fact is that fortifications often have been used in an offensive capacity, especially during sieges in the early modern period. When besieging an enemy fortress, the attackers would often dig trenches forward. The trenches gave the engineers more protection as they worked, allowing them to create fortified bastions where artillery could be emplaced. These same trenches would then allow for the easy resupply of these artillery batteries by protecting the men carrying the ammunition forward. In this way, these offensive fortifications were used like a noose, ever tightening around the fort. They could also be used to give protection to assault troops as they moved into position. And we also know that this was used in ancient siege warfare as well as in the Middle Ages. As discussed earlier, the siege tower was a mobile fortification that was used offensively to attack enemy walls and towers. In modern times, we don't see fortifications used offensively as much, and to understand why, we need to consider that in the 18th and 19th centuries, artillery was generally short ranged. It had to be positioned close to a fort for maximum effect. Sieges were generally long, drawn out affairs unless one side got incredibly lucky or surrendered early. Modern warfare is much faster paced and fires a much longer ranged and more lethal. Precision weapons can focus destructive firepower in a very small space, allowing commanders to more effectively target and neutralize defensive strongpoints. And this is really the key factor. Calling in air or artillery strikes to neutralize the enemy strongpoint will always be exponentially faster than trying to dig a 500-meter trench to get into position for an assault. This is why we don't see offensive fortifications as much in modern warfare. So those are some of the ways that fortifications can be used, but what strategies are used to decide where and how to fortify? How do you maximize the effectiveness of fortifications? We'll cover 5 key principles here, and as always, let me know what you think. Do you agree or disagree, and do you have any thoughts that you want to add on to the discussion? The first strategy is related back to that basic principle we talked about a few minutes ago. Fortifications should be built in areas where they exert maximum control over movement. This could be stopping up a narrow avenue of approach, such as building a castle on a river or a fort in a mountain pass, or it could be to deny the enemy an avenue of approach that would otherwise be easy. For example, trench lines such as this one in the picture from Ukraine are dug across open countryside. Without fortifications, this open terrain would be ideal for fast moving armored operations. However, placing the trench here means that there is no longer an easy option for the enemy. A second strategy is that fortification should be combined with obstacles. We discuss obstacles a lot more in our previous video, so feel free to check that out. However, even more so than fortifications, obstacles are designed to control enemy movements. But an obstacle that isn't overwatched or defended is relatively easy for an enemy army to remove. For example, it's easy to bulldoze Dragon's Teeth if it's a nice sunny day, the birds are singing, and the enemy is nowhere in sight. It's substantially harder if there's an enemy trench line firing machine guns and anti tank missiles at you. So, fortifications are often employed to overwatch obstacles. We see a great modern example of this in the picture from Ukraine. Here, we can see these Russian defenses, and we can note how the trench line provides direct overwatch of Dragon's Teeth. In my opinion, it's probably a little bit too close to the obstacle. It would be better if it was located further back, but the basic concept is illustrated well here. The second reason obstacles are often combined with fortifications is to make the fortification itself more defensible. In ancient times, obstacles such as sharpened stakes or a ditch made it harder for enemies to attack fortifications. In modern times, minefields and anti tank traps serve the same function. But moving on from obstacles, the third strategy is that fortifications should be designed with mutual defense in mind. On a small scale level, this could involve ensuring overlapping fields of fire. This also plays into our next few strategies, but if done properly, each defensive strongpoint should be able to cover another. This way, the enemy is always facing fire from not one but two strongpoints. On a more strategic level, this often means ensuring that each defensive fortification is within supporting distance of other defenses or the main army. For example, Roman mile castles on Hadrian's Wall were designed to allow troops garrisoning one mile castle to provide support to the nearby mile castles as well, and we believe that the Chinese had a similar system for the Great Wall. This helps to ensure that the enemy can't simply focus on one point and only fight a part of your defensive force. Instead, you can shift your defenders around to put them where they're needed the most. And if the enemy does attack, that's where our fort strategy is going to come into play. The fort strategy is that fortification should be designed to allow defenders to use enfilading fire or fire into the enemy's flanks. The Star Fort is probably the most famous example of this. However, this was also understood in ancient and medieval warfare. For example, many castles are designed with towers that protrude from the walls. This would allow defenders on the tower to shoot crossbows or other missile weapons into the attacker's flanks, possibly bypassing those pesky shields. And in modern times, our picture from Ukraine shows us that the same concept is alive and well. While modern soldiers don't usually carry shields into battle, being shot at from the flank is still a demoralizing, disorienting, and terrifying experience. It takes a lot of training and discipline for troops to fight through this and maintain focus on their objective. And closely related to the idea of enfilading fire is our fifth strategy, which is that fortification should be used to create kill zones to maximize their effectiveness. And like I said, our previous two strategies of mutual support, overlapping fields of fire, and enfilading fire contribute heavily to this. However, it's also a lot more in depth. In ancient times, preparing an area to become a kill zone could be as simple as clearing trees and buildings out of the way to ensure that archers and crossbowmen would have a clear line of sight. We actually see this in several medieval sieges where the defenders fire the suburbs of the city in order to clear buildings out of the way so that the enemy can't use them for cover. But there were also early examples of pre-sighting locations for artillery or missile troops. Markers might be placed to allow the defenders to better gauge the range to the attackers, and alternatively, fortifications could be purpose-built to create a kill zone. A good example of this is the gatehouse with holes to drop rocks and burning oil onto the attackers. And moving forward to modern times, we often use artillery. In the US Army, we train to identify the likely avenues of approach to our fortifications. These avenues of approach are then pre plotted for artillery or airstrikes, as well as overwatched by overlapping fields of fire, usually from gun trucks or from the machine gun section. The fortifications also allow us to bring not just indirect fire, but also direct fire to bear. And just as castle battlements help to protect medieval crossbowmen from enemy archers, so too does a modern foxhole give the rifleman some measure of protection from enemy return fire. This in turn brings more combat power to the kill zone, which enhances its overall effectiveness. But those are five strategies that underpin the usage of fortifications. Each one is something that commanders should consider first when determining whether a fortification is needed, and then in planning and constructing the fortification itself. The last factor that needs to be considered are the twin constraints of cost and time. While an earthen rampart doesn't cost a lot of money, it does take time to dig up. A permanent fortification, such as a castle, could be a massive expenditure, both in terms of time and money. And in modern times, creating a layered defense with minefields, tank traps, trenches, bunkers, and anti aircraft positions can be even more expensive and time consuming. Often, a nation might not have the resources to construct the ideal fortification. For example, there might not be enough money in the treasury to build a new castle, or the enemy might be rapidly approaching, leaving time for nothing more than a hastily dug fighting position. As always, commanders need to be adaptable. A key lesson to learn from this and our other tactical truths videos is that you have to fight with the situation you're in, not the situation that you wish you had. Still, despite these constraints and the changes in technology, fortifications remain an integral and decisive part of military strategy. From a simple foxhole to enduring castles to the intricate layered defenses of modern battlefields, fortifications remain vital for controlling enemy movement and access. But of course, no defense is perfect. Walls can fall and trenches can be taken. In our next video, we'll flip the script and explore the ways in which commanders attacked fortifications. We'll examine the universal strategies used, as well as how they haven't really changed that much throughout the centuries. And that's an underlying theme for a lot of the things we discuss on this channel. While the technology may change, the basic principles that underlie warfare really don't. But thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments section what you think was the most impressive example of fortifications other than the Great Wall of China. And as always, take care until the next time.